Priya. We spoke back in May, and I had the great fortune to be able to interview you for Design Matters. And in that interview, we discussed your history, the trajectory of your life. We talked about your being born in Zimbabwe, how you and your family moved to Indonesia and The Hague before you left as a young girl for the United States. And you revealed an early memory that you had. And I'd like to continue that conversation and share what you told me with everybody here today. You told me that while at summer camp, you were a little girl, the other kids started to make fun of you for speaking English with an accent. And at that time in your life, it never occurred to you that you had an accent. And you ran home and cried, not because you were upset that you had an accent, but because of how the other children were treating you. And when you got home, your dad looked at you and said, "Priya, everyone has an accent." And it seems as if that was a really defining moment for you. Can you talk a little bit about how that shaped your understanding of otherness and inclusiveness?
First, I would just say I'm so happy to be here. And I was freaking out in the front. I was freaking out in the front. I get emotional when I see beautiful gatherings. So when you see work that makes you cry, you're doing the right work. Some people get emotional when they see beautiful clothing. It's like, okay, you need to be in fashion. Creative Mornings embodies to me transformative gatherings. And I would love to pick apart exactly why, but you embody your ethos and you include everybody else in the way you open and the way you begin. And it is an honor to be here. When I came home, my father is white American, born in Waterloo, Iowa, and my mother's Indian, and I grew up in 6 countries before the age of 6. And I came home, and he looked at me as a white American with an American Midwestern accent and said, yes, everybody has an accent. And in that moment, I thought, oh, so if everybody has an accent, that makes us the same. But the adjective before the accent makes us different. And it made me begin to realize that we choose the lens of which we want to see, the adjective or the noun.
Wow. I don't want to embarrass him, but I believe your dad is here.
He is here. My father is in the 3rd row. You can stand up, Dad.
When your parents lived in Zimbabwe, your father was a hydrologist and your mother was a cultural anthropologist. And the reason they lived in fishing villages was because it was a Venn diagram of what you've called poverty and water. And they eventually divorced and both remarried, and with joint custody, you pinged between their households, which you've described as, listen to this, toggling back and forth between a vegetarian incense field, Buddhist, Hindu, New Age universe, and a meat-eating, conservative, twice-a-week, church-going, evangelical Christian realm. And we wonder why she's in conflict resolution. What first drew you to conflict resolution as a career? Was it this rich, diverse background and navigating through these different ways of living and being, or just something inherent in who you are?
I was trying to figure out who I was and where I belonged to. I was a freshman at the University of Virginia, and at UVA, the first question I was asked when people met me was, "What are you?" And I literally didn't understand what that meant. I was like a first year, a woman, and it was a code I learned quickly for what race are you. And I learned very quickly in any environment, you learn kind of the codes here at Creative Mornings. The name tags have a very specific prompt, and they're activating a specific type of your identity. You're activated this morning as creatives. At UVA, we were activated as our racial identity, and I was curious why. I had never been in an environment where that was the primary lens. And so I learned I wanted to do something about it. It upset me. And long story short, I learned about a process called sustained dialogue, which is a conflict resolution process that brings groups together to have closed-door conversations in front of each other about taboo topics like race and religion and identity that is difficult to talk about. And I didn't pursue conflict resolution as a career per se. I was trying to figure out and work through my own pain, and I found a tool to help me do that.
And that work is actually sustaining at UVA still. Can you talk a little bit about that legacy?
We launched it September 10th, 2001, and wrote a letter to the administrator saying, we have a problem with race here. We'd like to start this process called Sustained Dialogue. It was started between US and Soviet citizens 10 years ago, 15 years ago, by a man named Hal Saunders. We're ready to bring it here to UVA. September 10th, 2001. Of course, 9/11 happened the next day. And the power of intention, not that I knew this was going to happen, but the power of intention was that letter created a framework and an idea in people's minds that we existed. And so it became this vessel that got poured all of everybody's kind of crisis and confusion and why is this happening and Arab American identity being activated on campus kind of got fueled into sustained dialogue. And so we were kind of at the right place at the right time, and it just exploded. It grew enormously at UVA. We had 17 dialogue groups ongoing of students, 12 to 14 students in a room that committed to, over the course of a year, to come together every 2 weeks for 3 hours and keep talking about race through a lot of the tension and baggage and pain. And it began to spread across college campuses. And at UVA, what we learned was 15 years, in fact, I think there might be a Sustained Dialogue UVA chair in the room. Yay!
Wow.
So Mallory emailed me 2 days ago saying, I'm so excited to see you in Creative Mornings. I'm a UVA moderator for 4 years in a row. I was the UVA chair, and I just graduated 2 years ago? 2014. So, 13 years later, there's somebody whose Sustained Dialogue has deeply impacted her, and she's now creating experiences in her company because of this deep, deep, deep craft, which is how do you bring together people in a room and help them say the things they wouldn't otherwise but need to?
How do you do that?
Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Through a lot of different things, but the first thing is through purpose, through owning the purpose that I want to do this. Through not stepping over the steps. So the first thing is, do you want to do this? And some people don't, and that's fine. So the first is you figure out, do I actually want people to say the things that I might be scared to hear? And if that is true, then to begin to decide, okay, who needs to actually be in the room? Who is willing to do that? And the third is figuring out in your invitation and in your ask, whatever that looks like, to begin to prime intentionally to say, this is what we are here for, would you like to come? In the same way that Creative Mornings started with a manifesto. And I loved how, what was the, Sam was sort of botching it up a little bit. And the audience kind of, you all took over. But what you are doing in this manifesto is, this is who we are for, would you like to come in and join? And if this is not for you, that's fine. But part of the act of transformative gathering is being willing to put a stake in the ground and saying, this is a disputable purpose, would you like in?
Disputable seems to be the operative word here. And you've talked about how in order for people to have a conversation about race, you have to have the right language before anybody could begin to understand each other, mostly because we use different phrases and language, and that can be something that offends without even necessarily realizing it. And I started to think about that concept and was wondering why there's so much fear around what we don't know about each other, as opposed to curiosity. So if we don't know the language, rather than, I hate the term, but lean into the sort of vulnerability that requires, why do we step back because we're afraid to make a mistake?
I think fear and curiosity are two sides of the same coin. And I think the power of a host is that you can decide which way to nudge. Often fear comes from both not knowing but also offending. And I think when the fear comes from not offending, if you're really listening, it's actually the fear is coming from love. And that's a different source than fear that comes from hate.
Why does it come from love?
because I'm not wanting to say something because I don't want to hurt you, which is different than wanting to say something trying to hurt you. And those are two different, and in the country, there is fear that comes from hate, make no mistake about that. But there is also fear that is coming from a future love. And what I'm trying to say is in any type of gathering, to have the courage to invite people to show the sides of themselves that they may not otherwise show, and particularly in terms of race or anything else, to start having people connect with each other in an identity that has nothing to do with race. So hockey players, or bulldog owners, or Meetup does this very well. Finding cross-sectional identities that are surprising to help you connect in a way that you wouldn't otherwise when something is kind of so loaded and baggaged.
I learned from you and some of the research that you've done and some of the work that the theologian Paul Tillich has inspired you to work on. He stated that there are two twin forces in all group dynamics, power and love. And I learned from you that he defines power as the ability to self-actualize, and love as the desire for the separated to become whole. And I also learned from you that power without love is abusive, but love without power is anemic, and that in all group life, whether a marriage or a friendship or a group of friends or a nation, you need to actually have both of these things in balance. So my question is it possible to work towards balance? Or is it something innate that either happens naturally or doesn't? How can you change that dynamic?
I'll give an example. I was working in an architecture firm, and I was advising an architecture firm. They were a 70-year-old firm. They were founded after World War II, so their ethos was kind of having housing for soldiers to come home, and they were very invested in their brick and mortar identity. We build buildings. And I came in because they were thinking about changing not just their identity, but what they actually do in the future. They were thinking about being experienced designers. And I came in to help them have this conversation. And I was facilitating, and they knew I was there for that. And I tried to kind of push and poke, and everyone was kind of leaning back and not wanting to get into it. And what I would say is that culture was too heavily love without power. It was an anemic conversation. People were not willing to kind of battle it out in the best sense of that word. And so as a facilitator in that room, what that room needed was more power. And what I mean by power is the Paul Tillich definition of it, which is an ability to self-actualize. And a deeper way to say that is an ability for people to actually say what they think rather than please each other. So if love is the idea of pleasing, I want to be like you, and so I'm going to agree with you. Power in this definition is, this is who I am, I disagree with you, and let's talk about the difference. And so what we did, I had to create a quick alternative gathering within that gathering. And so my client leaned over to me and said, Priya, we need more heat. This isn't working. They're too nice to each other. They're too nice to each other. There's too much love in the room. And so they went on a coffee break, and we quickly, fortunately they're a very open-minded client, we quickly borrowed some towels from the bathroom, photoshopped with Adobe, thanks Adobe, two giant-sized posters, the body and the head. We cut two heads of each of the architects who were kind of playful architects and pasted them on each of the wrestlers. They came back and we literally staged a cage match. And so the architects came back. There was like 30 of them. They looked very surprised. I worked with their surprise. Part of the art of gathering is to get people off their scripts and do things that are unexpected. And I came in, I said, welcome to the cage match. Literally, the intern put Rocky music on. We put a mic up to the little laptop. Exactly. And they came and they're like, what is going on? Is she going to literally make us fight them? And I was literally injecting power into the room. Again, Paul Tillich's definition of power, which is say what you actually think. And they came in, and I said, okay, these are the rules. The body gets 2 minutes. The body represents the future direction of the firm being bricks and mortar. We're going to stick with architecture. Over here, the head. The head represents design. The future of the firm is experience. We're going to get away. We don't need more buildings. We need more human experience. You get 2 minutes to argue the future of the body. You get 2 minutes to argue the future of the head. Go. And the deepest design that we put into it was everybody else had to choose a side. And that was transformative because their cultural norms in public was to collectively agree with each other. So in that context, the balance was this group needed more power and less love. And then they came out of it and they realized the kind of the best debates of both sides. And then I closed it, and then they stepped back out and they went back to a culture in which love trumping power was working for them. So part of the discernment between power and love is understanding when do you need which, and when do you need more I, and when do you need more we, and allowing both to exist, but not necessarily always at the same time.
I find it so interesting that people that know and care about each other avoid conflict almost at all costs. You know, that artificial harmony is something that we just keep working towards. But yet strangers, often strangers on the internet, find it very easy to be completely vitriolic and cruel. Why is there that abyss between conflict avoidance and conflict intention in these two different types of human dynamics?
I would call that vacillating between unhealthy peace and unhealthy conflict. I was recently at a conference where I met a man named, I think his name is Saket Soni, and he said to me, knowing my background was in conflict resolution, he said, I truly believe that if we had more conflict in the world, we would have less violence. And I thought that was brilliant.
If we had less conflict in the world.
If we had more conflict, if we have more healthy conflict in the world, we would have less violence. And he was making a distinction between violence and conflict. And I think part of what we are not good at, and I think it's a little bit of a modern phenomenon, because if you look at tapes, you know, even from the 60s and 70s of public debate between William Buckley Jr. and, thank you, Gore Vidal. Incredible healthy conflict that everybody would be watching, and they'd really get into the ideas of it. And I think that in our multicultural world, we've lost a capacity for civic discourse, in part because we don't have a common language, and in part because we're operating in a different power structure. And so the structures of power need to be updated to actually involve and to integrate and to, whether it's gender or whether it's race. At the same time, there are true ideas that we're not talking about because the power structures are so complicated. And so we veer between unhealthy peace and unhealthy conflict. And I think on the internet, in part because we have avatars and because we can't see each other, and I think because we don't have healthy conflict in person, it goes into unhealthy conflict online because we actually don't have the tools to disagree with each other and still respect each other.
Why, as a species, are we so afraid of conflict? I mean, think about it. We, as a species, will pay, or some of us will, pay to see other humans hit each other. But yet, we are so hesitant, we are so afraid to actually disagree and have to figure out how to come back to a place of togetherness in that disagreement. Why is that so much a part of who we are as humans?
Conflict is about power. And one of the people I interviewed for the book, it didn't make, there are a number of lost chapters in the book. Thanks, Jake, my editor. And they should be lost. And the Riverhead team is also here. One of my favorite interviews was a man named Derek Oyongo. He runs the Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta, and he is Ugandan, and he told me the story about kind of myth. Or, I mean, it's true, but he hadn't seen it. He comes from a line of kings in Uganda, and he talked about this tradition that they had generations ago called the unhappiness courts. And in his tribe, there were these conflict resolution facilitators, to co-opt, to plug my profession, called ababakas. And what they would do is they would go around to the different communities and just listen and hear when is there some small conflict, and then what he would call a teenage lie or a teenage conflict, and they'd make peace between people. And then sometimes if it didn't, it might start with a conflict around borrowing bread or seeds. And then if it's not resolved, it ends up becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and those people are selfish people. Those are the people that we can't trust, and it starts to get what he called a dangerous adult lie. He was using lie as untruth. And what they would do to deal with this conflict is they would create these, when it got big enough that a conflict was affecting more than the people who were just in it, which is a dangerous type of conflict. They would create these unhappiness courts where the ababakas would create these large public collective rituals. They would open it up. They would create, in my language, a temporary alternative world to step in and to deal with conflict, because conflict does have danger in it. And they would open up with dancing and tribe and like kind of clearing the air. And then the ababakas, because there was an insight that not everybody who has pain can tell their story in a way that is hearable. The ababakas would listen to the conflict and sing what had happened, sing the pains, sing it out. It was collectively witnessed. They would transform the conflict. It was like a court, except it was all through song, and it wasn't trying to punish people. They would all watch, and they would close the ritual, and it would clear the air. And part of the reason we're scared of conflict is because it is dangerous. And we have lost our collective rituals to deal with it outside of basically a jurisdictional punishment regime that is court. The restorative justice movement is starting to do much of the creative work around this, but we no longer have collective rituals to understand how to deal with conflict safely. And therefore, I think it goes into unhealthy heat.
I was talking with somebody yesterday, and there was conflict in the air. And
Between you and that person?
Between a group of people. It was a small group of people, and there was conflict, and I was witnessing the conflict, and I was witnessing the sort of angst that this one particular person was having. And I realized afterward that even the way we talk about conflict in conflict is skewed. So I looked at her, and I sort of wanted to reach out and touch her, and I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "I'm fine." And we all know that the answer, "I'm fine," never means I'm fine. Ever. But I realized afterward that even the question, "Are you okay?" begs for the response, "I'm fine." And even in that sort of what we go to as comfort questions are skewed to the wrong answers.
It's a beautiful insight. "Are you okay?" implies that her anger or discomfort is unokay.
Right.
And part of the trap of all of this is that our questions and our language beguile the assumptions underneath them. And part of the reason why marriage therapy or conflict resolution is so powerful is because it gives a common language and a common structure for a temporary moment of time to destigmatize attitudes, language, and behavior that we assume to be scary. Maybe to go to your fear versus curiosity question, perhaps instead, you could ask a question that is like, what are you experiencing right now?
So that there gives...
She may still escape, but it's how do you ask a question that doesn't hold judgment within it, but you're in a group context, and so other people may shut it down because they're uncomfortable. So one of the things in this book that I in terms of the art of gathering and hosting is it's very difficult to create gatherings that don't assume your own biases as a host.
Talk about what that means.
So depending on your conflict style, so the transformative gatherings, and for this book I interviewed over 100 different gatherers who don't think of themselves as gatherers necessarily. So a rabbi, a summer camp counselor between Jewish and Arab students.
An Obama summit, just a gathering.
The New York Times page 1 meeting, a dominatrix. And the common thing that I heard in so many of these conversations was that the transformative unit of gathering was that every gathering that had some kind of transformation carried some amount of risk. That risk can be psychological, it can be emotional, it can be physical. So like Tough Mudders literally have, weekend marathons. Have anyone done Tough Mudder in the room? Woohoo!
Wow.
Do you have a tattoo of the Tough Mudder? Anyone? They have high tattoo ratios. It's true. And they literally create some of their obstacle courses, create live, like electric wire. You get electrocuted as you swim through buckets of ice. Like it's crazy amounts of physical risk. When you are hosting a gathering, whether it's a dinner party or a meeting or a workshop, when something happens, when there starts to be conflict between people, you as a host have disproportionate authority to set what is okay here. And if you are conflict averse, it's going to be very difficult to create the space that allows people to seed it out. So part of the reason Creative Mornings in its DNA in 188 different cities, it allows and gives us permission and this warmth and this love and this purpose-fueled DNA, because that is what Tina carries. If this, and it's very difficult to not have your gathering skewed to you. So you might as well embrace you. And when you have parts that are blind spots, have somebody co-host with you that doesn't have that blind spot.
People come together for all sorts of reasons. Some are happy reasons, some are sad reasons. It could be to conduct business, to celebrate, to mourn. How do you get at what the intrinsic purpose of an event or a gathering is, as opposed to the expectation?
You mean for the guests?
For the guests or the host. So
we tend to conflate category with purpose.
What does that mean?
So, for example, when I say I'm having a birthday party, we all have most of us have a specific archetype in our head of what that means. A birthday candles, a cake, maybe people kind of meandering in the living room. At least those are the birthday parties that, sorry, Dad, I grew up with. And or a courtroom. A courtroom has to look a certain way. A boardroom, mahogany, wood, and we follow scripts in those categories. You walk in, you wear a specific jacket. And part of what I'm trying to say in The Art of Gathering is that the most powerful gatherings begin with purpose and don't begin with form. So, for example, the writer Jancy Dunn wrote this beautiful article in Real Simple about experimenting with these ideas. She wanted to host a dinner party, and I said to her, okay, well, why do you want to host a dinner party? And she said, well, because Real Simple told me to host a dinner party. And I said, well, if you were going to host a dinner party anyway, what is a need that you have in your life right now that would thrill you to gather people around? And she said, well, I'm a worn-out mom. I'm exhausted. I have 2 kids under the age of 4, I'm forgetting the details, and someone made me a peanut butter sandwich the other day in the kitchen, cut it into triangles, I ate it, and I was so happy, I felt so taken care of. And I said, okay, let's build on that. And she said, what if I just threw a dinner party for my worn-out moms? Great. Give it a name. The Worn-Out Moms Hootenanny. Okay. Give it a rule. Make it specific. If we talk about our kids, we have to take a shot. Okay. It's disputable, right? It's moms, it's not parents. That's interesting, right? And you could push back on it. She's saying take a shot. I don't drink. It's disputable. She could decide, is it only alcohol or do I also allow the kombucha? Even if it's 2% alcohol. And so she crafted the email, and I said, call it the Worn Out Moms Hootenanny and tell a PBJ story. She did, and then she emailed me later, and she said all 6 people RSVP'd yes in the first hour. And it was this beautiful night, and it was a disputable, interesting purpose that was organic and matched a need in her life, and was beautiful to everybody else as well.
How do you become clear on the reasons that you want to bring people together? If it's a birthday party, do you want to encourage people to sort of get out of some of the trappings of having specific events because of a ritual, or do you think that it's better to have gatherings that are more spontaneous and from the heart?
The discerning gatherer understands the difference between routine and ritual. Rituals are powerful when the form continues to match the underlying need or purpose of the gathering. So I don't think spontaneity versus ritual is better one or the other. I think when your gathering matches the need, the natural need, the true need that you have in your life. Again, Creative Mornings, this is not a plug. Tina moved to New York 10 years ago and said, I need people, right? This is not a fake, I want to be seen in the world, I'm told to gather and therefore I want to be seen as this or that. It's an organic, clear need. You can see it emanating from her. So when you figure out what your need is, birthday party, right now in this year, what I need is actually to sit still. What if I invite my friends to a 6 a.m. meditation in Brooklyn Bridge Park? What if the need I need right now is to let go? What if I do a midnight water tower climbing expedition? So the idea is not so much follow this or follow that, but start with your need and communicate it to other people, and then exclude people in your life who are not going to help you with that need in that specific moment.
So I have one last question for you, and then we're going to open it up to the audience, despite the fact that I could speak to you for 2 more hours, at least. I had so many questions and topics I want to talk to you about. You just talked about exclusion. So last year, I went through a breakup, and I was talking to Seth Godin about it, and I was talking about getting used to being alone.
Me too.
And, and he said, "You're not alone, you're on your own." It's like, okay, I like that, I like that. Tina and I saw each other shortly thereafter. She was talking about being alone, and I said, "You're not alone, you're on your own." So at that moment, we decided to start a little club, a little group, and we called it the Triple O's, On Our Owns. And we invited other women that we knew that were also on their own. One of the women recently is no longer on her own. And Tina kicked her out. So how do you...
She's here.
I know.
She's
Bailey,
here.
we're not pointing you out. How do you avoid conflict in exclusion? Because I was so afraid Bailey was going to be hurt.
She's here. And I think it's awesome that she's here. And I think what happens is, first, it's such a beautiful example, because when you gather and when you exclude with purpose, you're not making it personal. And when we start creating a culture where we all gather on purpose and we develop a habit where we're cleaner and clearer with what we want and what we don't want now, not forever. Every gathering is temporary, right? So you may not rejoin their club at some point. Hopefully not. But right, like all of our identities, all of our conditions. I think there's also a relationship therapist in the room. So
Esther Perel
is she here or no? No. And if we gather with purpose, if we exclude with purpose, and if we don't hide from why we want to gather, we develop a cultural understanding of it so that it's not offensive, so that actually that person extracts themselves. And maybe you have a conscious decoupling party. I mean, seriously. So part of this is like one of the things I love I've just recently heard of divorce parties. And it's not that divorce shouldn't have a cut. It's not that there shouldn't be a cleaving in the sense of the letting go, but that divorces are complicated because they are also collective experiences. And friends don't know how all of the decisions about loyalty happens usually implicitly, who's going to go where. And one of the things I love is these kind of, they're parties, which might be a misnomer, of couples that gather their groups of friends and sit together, how do we do this? It's seeing the things that we used to avoid and developing the muscle to be able to look at truth and say, this is where I am right now, and will you come in, or will you leave our OOO club, and will you come Friday morning to Creative Mornings?
Thank you, Priya. We'd like to open it up now for a couple of questions.